Çinar is a professor, a faculty member of political science at Bilkent University, Ankara, Turkey. She has received her BA in psychology and MA in sociology from Boğaziçi University, which happens to be my alma mater, and PhD in political science from the University of Pennsylvania. She is the author of Modernity, Islam, and Secularism in Turkey, Bodies, Places, and Time, 2005. The co-editor of Urban Imaginaries, Locating the Modern City, 2007, and of Visualizing Secularism and Religion, Egypt, Lebanon, Turkey, and India, dated 2012. Her articles have appeared in numerous journals, too many to count, but just some examples include Comparative Studies in Society and History, International Journal of Middle East Studies, Theory, Culture, and Society, Theory and Society, Signs, among others. She has been the recipient of numerous awards and grants from different institutions, including Fulbright, the Ford Foundation, the Social Science Research Council, Mellon Foundation, United States Institute of Peace, and she was a member of the Institute for Advanced Study. Also, she has been the recipient of many Turkish grants, a distinguished teacher award from Bilkent University, and the Boğaziçi University Üstüner Research Award in Political Science. Her research interests include the intellectual foundations of politics, Islamic thought, political Islam, state building and nationhood, modernity and decoloniality, gender and patriarchal statehood, nation building, modernity, gender, urban space, secularism, and Islam in Turkey. She's currently conducting a research project titled The Islamic Intellectual Field and Political Theorizing in Turkey, which is funded by a very prestigious European Union Horizon 2020 grant, a part of which is the Global Faculty Fellowship, which has allowed her to be a visiting professor at Stanford University, which has allowed us to benefit from her presence in California and to piggyback on her visit here, to have her here. I should introduce the title of her talk today, which will be The Predicament of Islamic Decoloniality in Turkey, Sufi Political Thought, and the Great East Project of Necip Fazıl Kısakürek. And I want to thank the Center for Middle East and North African Studies for co-sponsoring this, as well as HistCon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I also want to thank the Center for Middle East and North African Studies and the History of the Business Department for having me here, and for Banu for arranging all of this. It's a really great pleasure to be able to present to diverse audiences, especially here. Now, this is a culmination of my 10 years of work that I've been doing, and I'm mainly interested in the relationship between Islam and politics, and also the intellectual foundations of that relationship. And the reason I'm interested in, I just let me say upfront, in Turkey right now, an Islam-based political party is in power. It may be their last 2 weeks, we don't know yet. We're having elections very soon. But even if they leave, Islam and political Islam, I'll refer to it there, is not going away. It's here to stay. And there's a diverse field, but really we lack, I think, in the academic world, I realized this is why I've been working on it for 10 years. We lack the conceptual tools with which we can understand this relationship thoroughly and deeply. That's what my goal is. So this is just, I'm not really directly interested in Necip Fazıl Kısakürek, I have to introduce him. It's indirectly that I found it very useful to start with him for reasons I hope will become clear during my presentation. Now, Necip Fazıl Kısakürek is not well known outside of Turkey, but he's very popular in Turkey. He's he died in the 80s. He was very actively publishing in the 50s, especially. I will mention that. But he's also the main ideological inspiration of Erdogan, President Erdogan. And to illustrate that, I use this quotation from that Erdogan uses a lot in his speeches. He refers to the story of Ferhat and Shirin, which is a Persian story, but very popular in Turkey as well. Ferhat and Shirin is a love story, very similar to Romeo and Juliet. But the story, Ferhat had to dig through an impassable mountain to reach Shirin because it was requested by her father, the Sultan, and he did it, what was thought to be impossible. He managed it, but then they died in the end, and it's an unhappy ending. But the reason Erdogan uses it a lot in his speeches, as you can see here, he refers to, he says quite frequently, he says, we are Ferhat, you are Shirin, referring to the people in public addresses. We, the state, is Ferhat, you, the people, are Shirin. We're doing whatever we can out of love, just like Ferhat's love for Shirin. Of course, no one asks what Shirin wants. But in the story, no one asks, but also Erdogan doesn't ask Shirin. He assumes that we know everything you want and we're doing it out of love, so you have no grounds for any objection. Now, I want to also just underline this concept of love. That's one of the basic concepts I will focus on here. And it is also the core of Sufi political thought that I will talk about. And that's why I start with this. Now, this quotation comes from Necip Fazıl Kısakürek. You can see in the 50s he wrote about this, using the same analogy. He says, best example of the love, ecstasy, zeal, and determination that the ideal, Allah, wants in the individual plan is Ferhat, who dug through the mountain to reach Shirin. And then he says, we cleared the way for our cause, which is exactly the same cause that Erdogan also assumes and puts forth in his talks, cause of the whole AKP movement. Our cause with the same pain and love that Ferhat had. We use this pickaxe, our hands and hearts covered in blood. So this passionate cause for transforming Turkey, for his project, is coming from love. Now, we see in his talks and his books, in his writing, this use of love and ecstasy, very frequently used in his political writing. Now, the significance, for my purposes, of Necip Fazıl in this presentation is I'm looking at him as one of the first intellectuals to build an Islam-based political ideology. This is not my interpretation, by the way. This is what the current Muslim intellectuals active in the field, which I will talk about in a minute, are saying. That even though they don't agree with his views, they say we take him as like a pioneer, as one of the first intellectuals who started an Islam-based political ideology, a political movement that stood up against the dominant Westernization, secular paradigm of modernity. Which was instrumental in the formation of the current Islamic intellectual field in Turkey, which I'm looking at in this project. He's also one of the pioneers of, this is my argument, Islamic, what I call Islamic decolonial thought that has become the common defining feature of the intellectual field in Turkey, Islamic intellectual field in Turkey. He's also one of the first intellectuals to develop what can be referred to as Sufi political thought. This is also a concept that I'm using. It's not really literature in Turkish on Necip Fazıl. Looks at his work more as for his literary work. There are a few more recent studies that look at his political thought, but none of them considered as anything that to do with Sufism. Although it is, I'm claiming that, Sufism for him is very central. His understanding of Islam is Sufism, but they look at it only for his literary work. I'm doing an exception here. So the Sufi political thought. Now, this is my argument that it looks much more crowded there, but actually there's one main argument here that kind of builds into that. I'm building into that. I'm starting with I'm going to try to demonstrate what is referred to as decoloniality, this recent literature, which is understood as the break free from the hegemony of Western systems of thought, started in Turkey in the 1950s with the emergence of alternative Islam-based intellectual and political paradigms, or what I refer to as Islamic decolonial thought, one of the pioneers of which was Necip Fazıl. The second point I'm going to try to demonstrate is that Necip Fazıl's thought and political vision, the Great East Project, what he calls, which envisions an Islam-based political system called the Başyücelik, chief sovereign, means state, and an Islamic revolution, Islam İnkılabı, is empowered by the emancipatory promise of decoloniality. I should mention that his use of revolution is not at all the Marxist sense, or it's not a societal bottom-up revolution. It's a completely top-down, more like a coup, kind of a system change is the term. That's because Kemalism also uses it that way. But I just want to emphasize that. Third point I'm going to try to demonstrate is that he attempts to establish a Sufi Islam-based alternative intellectual paradigm and political ideology, which I refer to as Sufi political thought, by offering a system that draws its legitimacy from the Sufi conceptualization of love. Sufi conceptualization of love in this context means love of Allah, being on a path toward Allah, being, this path, that is what Islam is for Necip Fazıl, which is very different than some of the other conceptualization of Islam in the intellectual field that I will talk about in a second. And the final key point I'm trying to make is that the predicament, there's a predicament here. This Great East Project, the system proposed in the Great East Project, envisions a very tightly regulated society, especially gender relations and family life, toward ensuring and forcing that everyone, and by that he means men, and I'll also demonstrate that, stay on the path of Sufi love, Islam. And this cause promotes an unchecked rule that stands above law, which we see very typical in Erdogan today, that he, as long as Ferhat is, we're doing everything with Ferhat's love, we don't have to abide by the law. This is a very typical understanding. This kind of summarizes everything he does. And it kind of has roots, I think, in Necip Fazıl's thought. And it is a totalizing project. This is a predicament that demands the suppression and elimination of rival Islamic as well as secular movements, thereby reproducing the same hegemonic logic that it seeks to dismantle. And I have mentioned, and it's also, I don't have time to go into this, but it's also very nationalist. Necip Fazıl is also Turkish ethnic nationalist. It was also a significant point because we don't see that kind of nationalism in most of the other Islamic movements in Turkey. But in Erdogan, absolutely, especially recently, we see it. These are the primary sources I'm using. This Great East Journal was started by him in 1943, and he is its lead author. And the other two books, this Ideological Letters and also the second one, that came many years later, but a year before he died, but it's mostly a collection of some articles here and also lectures that he gave throughout. This is, I want to stress, the title is Western Thought. We discusses Western Thought and Sufi Islam. Tefekkür is a difficult concept to translate. I sometimes translate it as episteme, because it's a deeper sense of knowledge than just dry knowledge. And he constantly stresses that. It's a more kind of paradigmatic knowledge, let's say, or it also means contemplation, for example. So it kind of deeper sense. But this is his book. Now, the title that he just mentioned there, this of course also, I don't talk about that, unfortunately I don't have time, but this is happening all in the context of the Cold War. It's significant because here the title that I chose, the sample journal, the title here, it says Liberate Freedom of Thought. And it's a criticism of the notion of freedom of thought, because he says in that journal that the United States is using this notion of freedom of thought, but it's actually only confined to certain ideas and thought systems, and it kind of with the same freedom is not applied to Islam. So he constantly refers to that, but I should also say that he's pro-American. And probably, again, we don't have time to go into that, but it's in the sense that, especially in the early years of the Cold War, the United States was also supporting anti-colonial movements so that they don't go side with the Soviet Union. And this is that anti-colonial is actually appealing to, and anti-communist also, because communism is also seen as a big threat to Islam for its atheism and for its excessive materialism as well that he criticizes. Ideology he sees as his main opus, where he puts together his political thought, the system that he calls his chief sovereign political system. And here in Western Thought and Sufi Islam, this book, he traces one by one anyone you can think of in Western political thought, starting from Greek philosophers, going through Machiavelli, and then also some, not only political philosophers, but also artists, key intellectuals, including Michelangelo, and everything, Kant, Hegel, Heidegger, Nietzsche. They're all there. There's either a paragraph or sometimes a couple of pages, especially on Marx, for example. He goes on and on, very harshly criticizing, of course. But then there's also Lenin and Charlie Chaplin, who both of them he admires Charlie Chaplin a lot because of his criticism of excessive materialism. And capitalism, but he doesn't call it capitalism, but he calls it excessive materialism. He kind of likes that. And Lenin he likes also for, not only intellectualizing, but actually going out and doing something about it. So he kind of also likes that. But the others, there's a very consistent criticism for the Western thought for being excessively materialistic, overlooking, dismissing the human soul, basically. And because of that, it lacks morality, he says, and he's trying to show how each one of these thinkers is doing exactly that, that they kind of lead the individual into unhappy, miserable life. And that's his main criticism. And the answer is Sufism, Islam, kind of. This is... Now, just very briefly, I say very briefly and then I end up talking. And why, let me say, this is just presenting the general framework of my project, overall project. I'm saying this because what I'm presenting here are mostly there are at least a couple of close to 10 icebergs here, and I'm only presenting tips. So this is what you're seeing here. This is why I can talk a long time about all of these, but I'll just try as best as I can to keep it brief. My overall goal is to actually, not like I said, Necip Fazıl Kısakürek, but this Islamic intellectual field in Turkey. And this is the field. Okay, these are the journals that I'm kind of looking at. And these are only journals I've included in my project. There are hundreds of journals. These are all Islam-based, all of them. And they constitute the Islamic intellectual field. What I'm trying to show is that this introduces this Islamic intellectual field in Turkey as a vast field of political theorists. I'm not interested in how they debate Islam. I'm not interested, of course I am, but indirectly. I'm directly at the core interested in political theorists. I'm saying that this field should be studied as a field of political theorizing because that's what they're doing. But when I started that's why it took me 10 years to come to this point. I realized we don't have the conceptual tools to do that. So I had to learn, understand. There's no literature on this, so I had to develop them, looking at their own stories and their own use of these concepts. And I will present that again briefly in a minute. These are the big icebergs that I have. Took a long time to kind of come to the tip. I'm also trying to develop a conceptual map of the intellectual field to determine the spectrum of alignments and camps, which I will very briefly also talk about. And I want to develop the notion of Islamic decolonial thought as the defining feature of this otherwise very diverse intellectual field. This field consists of many journals, periodicals, but also eventually, starting from the early 1990s, they all were only journals. Then a couple of institutes starts to open up, and associations. They started giving like classes. These are all outside the academic. None of them are academic. All of it. That's why it's not recognized as a field of anything or intellectual field. But then after AKPs, of course, supported some of these, more on the right side, conservative side, and they started opening up universities. So we have, since 2010, universities, some of which were supported by the AKP, most of them, that are also in the intellectual field. They bring this field brings together contemporary as well as classical, both Islamic and Western intellectual traditions. This field is not a study of Islamic theology. It is, it brings together, there are many different, some, not all of them, but many of them give references equally to Western political thought as well as Islamic political thought. So you have a very big, already very hybrid conversation going on, resources used. They cover themes ranging from politics, sociology, economics, philosophy, theology, and the arts. They include diverse viewpoints ranging from Sunni conservatism and Quran-based Islamism to Muslim progressivism. There's even Muslim anarchism here. They have a journal, and also Islamic statism. This is not very common, and maybe the most status top-down Islamic understanding is Necip Fazıl, definitely. And they debate concepts like, most frequently debated concepts are civilization, justice, localism, yerlilik. Sometimes it's translated as nativism, indigenism, but it's actually localism is the right word. Westernism, obviously, Islamist thought, nationalism, modernity, Ottomanism, history, all of these are debated frequently in the field. This is a collection of I did this collage myself, intentionally from the left to the right. This top one over here, for example, İştiraki, is a Marxist Islamic, but they're, Marxist. But then you have here, they call themselves Muslim left, socialist, Muslim socialists, but it's absolutely not Marxist. It's based on the Quran. So you have authors there, for example, his first name is Recep as well. Recep writes here. He is one of the leading intellectuals of anti-capitalist Muslims, and they're also here, the Labor Adalet Platform, Justice and Labor and Justice Platform. I will talk about that at the end, very end as well. And İhsan Ali Açık, for example, gives Quran courses. And in those Quran courses, he says things like, the description of heaven, they study the description of heaven in the Quran, and he says this is communist. So you see how this goods are distributed equally among people. No one, is lacking anything. Everyone gets what they need. This is communism. So, he's against private property. Capitalism, basically, a kind of private property. And he says this is also in the Quran. Quran says all property belongs to Allah. Therefore, no human should be, that ownership of means of production should not belong to humans. Things like this that are, just to show you. But on the right side here, here, this Baran, Academia and Alev, they're nationalists. They are, all three of these journals are continuation of the Necip Fazıl's thought. They propagate the idea of this Great East project still. They develop it, they kind of try to adapt it to current conditions. They are also anti-imperialist, they announce themselves as now they're very anti-American as well. And they're very adamant supporters of Erdogan and the AKP still today. So this is more right side. And then there are centrist ones as well, neoliberal Islam and those kinds of more pro-democracy and pluralist ones as well. Very briefly, Necip Fazıl Kısakürek, I'm asked this, was born in Istanbul to a wealthy upper-class family who was sent to France by the state on a state scholarship to study philosophy at Sorbonne University. But then he dropped out due to alcohol and gambling habits, and he continued all throughout his life. Although he writes in how these are very big sins and they shouldn't be done, but he was actually kicked out of this conservative party in the 50s, Democrat Party was in power for his gambling. He was caught gambling and I think put into jail as well for a bit briefly. He turned to Sufism at 30 years old, when he was 30, after falling into an existential crisis, and these are his words, due to his unrequited love for nokta. This means ... lady. It means anonymous lady. And this is also significant. We will see why because it becomes the basis of his Sufi thought as well. That love that we seek cannot be found in a woman. It can, women are a distraction. They veer you away from the right path because of this, sort of attraction that they have on effect on men. That's why men need to be protected. I want to mention the significance of that, and I will talk about that in a minute. He's known for his literary work, like I said, and he established the Büyük Doğu journal. And he sees this journal not only as, it was kind of couched in this literary, because he's a very famous poet and playwright and writer in Turkey, very good with his works, but he actually sees it as this spearheading kind of publication that will gather together the youth, especially directed at the youth, who will kind of initiate this big movement toward establishing the what he calls the greatest project, the chief sovereign state, to replace the secular Kemalist modern state. Okay, the key concepts I'm using here is the context in which I'm looking at. The reason why I'm calling it decoloniality. Now, this is a criticism that's brought to Turkey. Turkey was never colonized, but it was. It did give its war of independence against the colonial powers. Istanbul was occupied by the British twice, who also overtook the government, Istanbul government, for 1923. When Mustafa Kemal and the Grand National Assembly he established, started the Turkish national movement and won the War of Independence and established the Republic in 1923. Now this, which then resulted in what is called as Kemalism, this modernization project, state-led modernization, West-oriented, secular modernization project that adopted European modernity as the universal norm and framed the Ottoman system and Islam as inferior, backward, uncivilized. This is my previous work, the book Banu mentioned, 2005, looks at this, how Ottoman system and Islam was marked as inferior, backward, uncivilized. In this context, the adoption of European modes of modernity, systems of thought, political, legal, and economic institutions created an increasingly restless intellectual debate, not only among Islamic groups, Muslim groups, but also among leftists, secular nationalists, they eventually take on, that question the hegemony of Western-oriented modernity and the institutionalization of Western systems of thought and knowledge as the universal norm, and to replace them with local alternatives. This included, people who are familiar with Turkey know what I'm talking about, but this kind of hegemony involved shutting down all of these journals. Eventually, many of them, including Necip Fazıl, many of the Islamic intellectuals, Muslim intellectuals were thrown to jail. There's a clause in the constitution that defines seculars as any sort of use of Islam for political purposes is banned. Now, as we will see, the whole, I will talk about this briefly, the whole Islamic intellectual field, whether it's on the left or the right, whoever you ask, all the intellectual movements see Islam as inherently political. It's all political Islam. They look for political agency. And this is the defining mark of the Islamic intellectual field. So it's not the way political Islam, if you say political Islam, and there are groups right now in Turkey, even participating in the elections, Turkish Labour Party, for example, is a young, very active, good one, I should be. Exactly. You know how I feel now. But they say we're going to end political Islam. And I kind of cringe at that because it's not going to end. And also when you're trying to end it, there are good, groups that should, I think, be supported in this framework for reasons I will talk about. Yes, there are some that are not. So they do much more harm than good, but anyway. Decoloniality in this context, as I mentioned, started with Islamic intellectual circles. This desire to be free from and this is a term they use now, break the hegemony of Western episteme. Started with Islamic intellectual circles in the 50s, but then, I'm not looking at this, but I'm just mentioning it. It's also left-wing secular nationals of the 60s, the Yön movement. There's a journal that started, has nothing to do with Islam, very secular nationalist. Later in the 2000s turned into this Ulusalcı movement, which is very anti-West European, but secular Turkish nationalist, Kemalist also. Then in the 70s, we have countercultural movements like the Arabesk movement, kind of comparable to rap, the Turkish version of rap that produced adaptive fusions and hybrid forms of modernity, but they also contested Westernization from a different angle. Very harsh contestation of Westernization. And then you have a localist turn in the 80s that, let's go back to our roots, kind of, let's look for the local. And it's the Islamic movement defines the local as Islam. This is what, but there are other groups who define the local in different ways as well. But I'm looking at how Islam, but what kind of Islam, that's the big debate. And AKP, when it came to power in 2002, kind of put together all of this. It was supported by almost the whole intellectual field and the movements that they represent. The key concepts I'm using, I already went through this, but very quickly. This is decoloniality, the colonization of knowledge comes from this recent literature that started with Quijano and Walter Mignolo in the United States. And I use the term Islamic decoloniality, it's not in literature, to refer to the desire to break what is perceived as the hegemony of Eurocentric Western episteme over Islamic knowledges and ways of being, as well as the adoption of Westernization as part of the Kemalist founding ideology in Turkey that has been termed as self-colonization. So by some of the Muslim intellectuals. And Islamic decolonial thought I'm using to refer to how, in response to this decoloniality, this desire to break, Islam-based political perspectives and kind of systems of thought are being produced. But again, I should mention, there are some who are very essentialist in defining what Islamic thought is, so they only use Islamic texts, but this is rare. Majority of these movements actually combine Western intellectual traditions with Islamic. And some of them, especially AKP-related intellectuals, say things like, oh, Islam has already done, like, even like Edward Said's Orientalism, they say, oh, we had done that, like, in the 1930s. Or someone's, determines, Marxist determinism, oh, we had done that in the, 13th century. You have things like this that are trying to bring back Islamic thought. There are, I think, very interesting things that are going on. And this is what I'm claiming that is the common feature of the intellectual field in Turkey, Islamic intellectual field in Turkey. Now, this slide, it took me 3 years to come up with this slide. This is the conceptual framework that I found. Without understanding this conceptual framework, we cannot understand what's going on. These concepts, this akılcı here, which means like reason-based thinking, This is Naqshbandi, which means it is empiricism I mentioned here, but I'll explain what it means in a minute. It's kind of traditionalism also. And Mükemmel is a Sufi term. These three have been frequently used, especially constitutive divide, the first two, appeared to me in interviews that I was doing, as well as the journals themselves. But when I looked for a term to literature, to understand what they are, there's no literature. And there is a lot of things from theology schools, but nothing really that looks at them like Islamology. There is Al-Jabiri and Abdurrahman, Islamic philosophers, who have done a three-way division of Islamic rationalism. But it's kind of coincides with that, but not, there are differences as well in the case of Turkey. Now, this is the Quran-based approach, which is the basis of Quranic Islamism, is that these are political movements that say all the answers we seek to solve current problems, not only Turkey's, but the world's, humanity's problems in the Quran. So it's Quran-based, not the Hadith, right? This is it's very simple. The Hadith is the second group. These are Quran. Now, this means, like I said, these are three iceberg tips, big icebergs, so I can go on and on. I'll try not to. But the reason I'm mentioning this here, by the way, let me say, Necip Fazıl Kısakürek, and he is adamantly contesting both of these. He hates both of those. He thinks this is what Islam is and nothing else. So there are big clashes among these three groups. Some of them also overlap, but there are also big clashes. Now, the Quranic Islam is Quran. They are against sectarianism for that reason, because sectarianism divides. This is the kind of Sayyid Qutb, Afghani, that lineage of contemporary Islamic thought. It kind of affected, this came later, after Necip Fazıl's time to Turkey. This is not popular in Turkey. It doesn't, because Turkish Ottoman understanding of Islam is definitely this, right? But this understanding came in the 60s after Sayyid Qutb's milestones was translated by the Islamic intellectuals themselves, some of them. So this is a Quran-based understanding of Islam, and it's also universalist. It's Ummah-based. They support the Iranian Revolution. But some of them don't. Also, Muslim leftists here, for example, like I mentioned that the Eastern intellectual inspirer of anti-capitalist Muslims uses the Quran to base his ideas. There's also, at the end, I will mention a little briefly. There is a recent association called Muslim Feminists Association, and they're saying their motto is we're going to localize feminism. Where feminism has been kind of monopolized by the West, we want to have our own feminism, and it's also based on Quran. They're using the Quran. They have a feminist theologian who, for example, contests the language of the Quran for saying it's patriarchal. So that's coming from Arabic. It cannot be coming from Allah. So there are very interesting debates going on there. It's all Quran-based. Not all of them agree with the views of the term Islamism, but for lack of it, maybe Islamic politics, or I don't know, but that's what it means. They're very, reason-based. It's an interpretation of the Quran using reason, which is also, they say, is indicated in the Quran. It's the Quran says use your aql. Aql is not mind, it's more intellect, I guess. A higher notion of heart-based intellect to understand and read the Quran. This is in stark opposition to this group, by the way. I have to emphasize that. For them, and it's not traditionalist understanding, the Quran is completely off limits. The Quran was not meant to be understood. It's not a rational text. The Prophet was sent for us to tell us how to understand the Quran. No one can go and read the Quran. If you try to read it, you'll go crazy. This is a kind of extreme, but it's the Ash'ari school, the sect of Islam, that includes 3 of the major sects in Sunni Islam, the Shafi, Maliki, and Hanbali, which includes the Salafi movement, by the way, and they're all here. These are empiricism. The reason I'm saying empiricism is because it is hadith-based, there have developed over the thousands of, hundreds of years of the sectarian schools of Islamic thought. How do we know which hadith are real and which aren't? That's the main one. So they develop strict methodologies to determine which hadith are real and which are not. Down to like, we need 5 independent witnesses, no, 5 is not enough, 10, no, 10 is not enough, 20, kind of. Whose declarations, whose testimonies do we take as real? Again, big debates. All of these are empirical debates, okay? Who is believable and who's not? There's a distrust of reason, just like a similar, debate in Western thought, reason versus empiricism. They are also the authority of the ulama. The ulama, if this is Hanafi school, Sunni, main Orthodox Sunni conservatism, okay, a little bit of reason can be used. It's not as harsh as the more traditionalists, but only the ulama can. No one else can do it. Whereas here in Quran, these are journals, for example, Wuslat here, as you can see here, it says, can't see, but it says the virus that destroys the ummah, the terrible virus that destroys the ummah is nationalism. So this is Quranic Islamism that kind of supports the ummah, is internationalist. And these journals are here, Iktibas also, Quranic Islamism, and somewhere here, Haksöz here, doesn't appear. These are all saying, everyone, take the Quran and read it. Okay, they support, of course, it should be translated into Turkish. We should discuss the Quran. And now when you look at it, they say, that's blasphemy. Salafis say, these are our worst enemies, Quranic Islamists, because, it's blasphemy to say, it's kind of giving something that's sacred, taking away the sacredness of the Quran, and personify God, which is for them the worst possible sin. This is the situation. Now, Sufism here is what is significant to understand Necip Fazıl, because his whole criticism of Western thought is based on this has been neglected. This is where it happens. Now, Mükashefe is a Sufi concept. It means, it's not very widely used in Turkey either. No one really knows it. It's rooted on this Arabic root word keşf. In Turkish also we use keşf, means discovery, but this is a different kind of discovery. It is discovery beyond reason and beyond the senses. So it's both against this one and against empiricism of it. You cannot understand Allah or reach Allah apart from love. It's beyond reason, it's beyond the senses. The only way to attain truth is experiential. So experience, the rituals, the zikr for Sufism, this whirling dervishes, there are many other things, zikr performances. It's ritualistic. It has to come with experience. Otherwise, it's not true knowledge. It's all misleading. This is where we see Necip Fazıl. Now, also Sufism in itself this is also important to understand. Necip Fazıl is a very big divide. The mainstream of Sufism in Turkey is Orthodox Naqshbandi Sufism, which came to the Ottoman Empire in the 17th century. Other older, these unorthodox Sufism, Anatolian Sufism, is much older, 12th century, 11th, 12th century, and Mevlevi also is here, kind of, at least outside of Naqshbandi. Now these are, but this is the dominant one. For example, Iskender Pasha is what Erdogan belongs to. And right now, these are all many of the members of the AKP are within these tariqats. And Orthodox Naqshbandi Sufism, for them, Mükashefe, this discovery, experience, is a communal experience. It's not an individual experience. And zikr is performed in secret, and devotion to Allah is measured by obedience to the sheikh. So the sheikh has utmost authority. You can't, as an ordinary person, you can't expect to reach Allah. You can only expect to reach the Sheikh. This is where, you know, there's they use silsila lineage linked to the Prophet for Abu Bakr, and they have a very hierarchical structure. This is what makes Sufi thought stand above law. Okay? It's the same here in the tariqas we see today. There's complete disregard of law, as long as you're abiding by the, you know, the demands of the tariqat and the sheikh. And Mücadele Naqshbandi also, Necip Fazıl, and most of these are also, but especially Necip Fazıl. This comes also from the 16th century. I think in Syria it started the Mücadele movement. They recognize the Sharia. Unlike the Mevlevi, for example, this is also significant in Necip Fazıl's thought. We will see Sharia an absolute, establishing political connections with its Ottoman state has started. This is significant because other Sufi groups, like Mevlevism, Rumi's, Mevlevism, for example, does not have this at all. And Necip Fazıl criticizes it for that reason. And for that reason, Mevlevism, for example, all the other groups are, they have no problem with the secular state. They have no problems with Kemalism. That's perfectly fine. Because, you know, Sharia is not Sufism for them. Whereas for him, that's one of the reasons why it's very pro-Ottoman and also wants rules of the Sharia to be enacted. These are two groups. This is the Menzi leader, Sheikh, currently very fused with bureaucracy, complete hold on the Ministry of Health. They say these are all not but dominant. And this is an example I put as unorthodox Sufism. This is an Imam rock singer who was actually kind of removed from his position as Imam. But you know, he appealed to the courts, and I think it's still maybe continuing. But this is for them, Sufism, Nikash is an individual experience. This Mullah Matia, for example, is now what Muslim anarchists are. You know, most of the Muslim anarchists, they're against the state. They have been persecuted since the Ottoman times by the Naqshbandi, especially. So there's a huge contestation going on there. Now, Necip Fazıl's conception of Islam is Sufism. I'm going to go through this quickly a little bit. And the ultimate principle for him is spiritualism, ruhçuluk, what he calls the effect of reality cannot be measured through dry knowledge and reason beyond dry. It is always beyond dry observation and dry experience. And he also mentions the supremacy of Mücadele Naqshbandi Sufism. Those who accept Sufism as the basis of religion alone, and he's talking about the Mevlevi in other part of this quote, he refers to the Mevlevi order as doing this, are those who reject Sharia. What these men do is blasphemy. They are nothing but tricksters. His criticism of other Sufi orders are also as harsh as his criticism of secular national Westernizations. He's critical of continuationism. Truth cannot be reached by reason, only by surrender. You see this. And also in the Hicri tradition. Now, for him, this continuationism came to Turkey through, it started in Ottoman Tanzimat period. This is the beginning of modernization through Westernization, right? So this is what he's criticizing here. This huge kind of idealization of reason and science came through Westernization modernity, but he's also critical of this traditionalism, which he says goes back all the way to the time of Suleiman the Magnificent, the 16th century, who started to introduce laws. That's what he's known for outside of the Sharia. So, and also the beginning of ulama. So this kind of, knowledge being hadith studies, and the Sunni Islam becoming so, harshly scholastic and authoritarian. He says our cause is to say Islamic ideology that became a dry, arbitrary acts of nas, teachings are based on the Quran and the Hadith, in the hands of crude and vulgar fanatics. He's talking about ulama. who lack any wisdom and originality. It is to understand Islam is all it's true. So Islam should be all about love for him. Okay? So this is also criticized from both parties. His notion of human, he says, human becomes a human only through love, and its original goal and its creator is Allah. Love of Allah is the only way a human will become a human. Otherwise, he's not a human. Human is man. There's Allah. This is a quotation from his preface of one of his plays, very famous play. There's Allah and human before Allah. There's death and human before death. Human before society. Human before woman. We see this a lot. I mean, when he's talking about human, all his design for society is based on man. For him, women are props. Let's say, well, this is what woman. Now here, woman means for man to find path to Allah. And here he's addressing this dot lady, the anonymous lady that he fell in love with. And the point he's trying to make is you're a dream, nothing but a dream, a shadow, a light, it's a symbol. Chasing after a dream, looking for love in a woman is a big distraction. She's there only for me to understand that it's not there. She can't give me what I want. What I really want is love Allah. So this is significant because, as we will see, for him, men, I mean, society, by that he means men, needs to be kept on the right track. For them to stay on the right track to love of God, they have to stay away from women. And adultery and prostitution, those are the two biggest vices. This is why concepts of love and ecstasy, but also the sins of prostitution and adultery are so frequently mentioned in his political text. Why would he do that? This is the reason. Okay, for him, this is how the state needs to protect the men. Where is his decoloniality? This is a direct quote from him that he wrote in the 1950s. Our ultimate cause is, I translated this, but I stay true to the words that he uses, unless it's difficult to translate. Our ultimate cause is to end, in theory and in practice, which is what something Mignolo and his followers also stress a lot. Decoloniality is not only an intellectual movement, it's also a political movement. Okay, so he's saying this is what it means. In theory and in practice, the catastrophe of captivity into which we have been deceived in return for a bargained independence. This bargained independence is what Kemalism has done, to kind of compromise our true, passion and love in return for this kind of, so-called independence he's criticized. Our ultimate cause is also to extirpate the bitter knot of Western supremacy with all its regimes, laws, notions, customs, tools, tastes from within us. Let's take it outside of us to understand and say no to the full spiritual colonization. These are his words, in which the imperialists outside have condemned us through their imitative spies within us. That's Kemalism again, under the banner of Westernization. He wrote his words in 1950s. This is what I'm basing my claim that this is decoloniality, Islamic decoloniality that started in the 50s. Also elsewhere, he says, our cause is much more arduous and formidable than the mountain Kermat tried to dig through. We need an epistemic struggle, tefekkürce. This is, again, my translation, but in the intellectual struggle, you can also say, so torturedly devoted that it almost suffocates. This is dramatic language that he uses in his poetry a lot as well. This work has weaved together fiber by fiber a system that will save Turkey, the Islamic world, and all humanity. So he's not only trying to save Muslims or Turkey, he's trying to save all humanity. And the pitfalls of Western thought, I already talked about it. This is criticizing it for excessive materialism and excessive rationalism that leaves out the human soul and lacks morality. And he says it consists of nothing other than an unprecedented, enormous procession of material and plastic construction. This is repeated over and over in all of his, especially this book, the Western Thought and Islam, Sufi Islam book. The Great East Project, I should very quickly. The Great East Project, why I call it Sufi political thought, I'm trying to demonstrate here. Legitimation of, this is my political science interest here. Legitimation of political authority, I look for this in theory, how he legitimizes it, and he says the rulers, the Great East Project will produce the system, the regime, the executive, which will always find the main source of its authority, all its decisions and directives readily available, as long as it's spiritualized with love and inspiration. This is where he uses this a lot. As long as they're doing everything they are, like Farhad, out of love, it's legitimate. You don't need consent of the people. You don't need elections. He doesn't talk about elections at all. It's irrelevant as long as they do it with love and ecstasy. Legitimation of Turkish nationals is also coming from Sufis. He says supreme nationalism, and there's only Turkish nationalism. All the others are mistaken nationalisms, dry. Ethnic nationalism, he criticizes for the same reason. Supreme nationalism is all about loving the Turk because he loves Allah and his messenger the most. It is all about sprinkling the Turk's personal and national soul treasure on this foundation of love, from which its spirit will blossom. But what is significant here is that he sees, for him, the truth, hakikat, truth is in love of Allah. You can attain truth there, but then it is up to, this is where he goes outside of Sufism actually, you need to the individual, the group, the project, and the Turk needs to take that passion, take that love, and materialize in the world, in the material world. And it's only based on love. If they do it based on love, then it becomes productive, it serves humanity. Otherwise, it just defeats everything, all the purposes. Regulation of society also, this is significant. Half the book maybe, a lot of very detailed rules in this Great East Project and the chief sovereign state. Our cause will have a whole plan that enhances the institution of marriage, educates children and young people, and ensures constant submission through both legal measures and personal indoctrination. You can see how totalizing authoritarian understanding of state rule is here. It's about law, but also wants to regulate a society, harsh control for these reasons. Like I said, sexuality especially needs to be regulated by the state. Prostitution and adultery are strictly prohibited for the reasons I just talked about. And I gave these examples from dancing, but there's also a lot of things as well, like the regulation of hotels, for example. It's in his book, or bed and breakfasts. All so that men don't fall into the traps of prostitution and adultery. So that they can be protected to stay on the right path. And it is the duty of the state to do this. The day one dance enters our Islamic national systems, it becomes destructive. There is no difference between dance and committing adultery in public. And he says dancing came. Hatred of dance is that the uncontrolled or unaccountable imitation of the Occident is what makes, all of this. This is the big traps for men to veer off the path. This is the predicament. I already talked about this very quickly. I'll go through it. These are other quotations which shows how legitimation, the legislative branch that is described in the book, Yüceler Kurultayı, it lives in ecstasy and love. It is devoted to nothing other than this cause. The penalty for absolute blasphemy is absolute death. And the penalty for every vision and attempt that puts this country under the command of blasphemy and deception, with communism at the forefront, is execution as soon as it's proved. Communists hanged. And he says, until there is only one woman and one man left, who will be the core of the society of our dreams, it is necessary to cite the whole community if necessary. Again, you see the totalitarian. Now you see elements of that. No one's citing the community right now, But at some level, you see similar elements in Erdogan and his current. It wasn't so in the beginning, but right now, this, for example, opting out of the Istanbul Convention against domestic violence. Turkey opted out 2 years ago, was it? Or yeah, for this reason. The same logic there that the institution of family is crucial for the exact same reason that if family is torn apart, men will have to seek for love in women, in prostitution, and other things. So the family, this is also in Necip Fazıl's writing a lot, protecting the family, early marriage, so that men stay, on the path. Conclusion, this is, I already talked about this, but Erdogan still uses this Ferhat Şirin, we're doing everything out of love, still, 2022, November. Also, his Turkism, he switched Erdogan in 2015. He ended the Kurdish resolution process, which was kind of justified in this anti-nationalist stance that had united the Islamic intellectual field in the early years of the Republic and caused them to support it. He ended it and made an alliance with the ultra-nationalist National Action Party, who is still in power right now. And these are kind of all indicating his nationalism. And also his, how disregard for the law and the constitution has become the norm, also inspired. Now, current AKP intellectuals are using this colonial stance. These are two quotes I think are very significant, very recent. One of them is Yusuf Kaplan, a pro-AKP, very prolific intellectual, writes a lot in some right-wing conservative journals. He says there are some leashed grasshoppers in the Turkish academia and media who speak with the language of the mentally colonized, epistemic slaves in love with their executioner. He uses the word epistemic. It's his word, not mine. And the Minister of Finance, current Minister of Finance, Nurettin Nebati, just recently said, all epistemological breaks are ours. This is when he was criticizing the main secular opposition party, CHP, for hiring an American consultant in the economic policies. And they criticized that we don't hire American consultants. So all epistemological breaks are ours. My final slide, I just wanted to show them in here, the localization of the Muslim feminist group. Here, you can't see it, but here, this is a talk run by this association on support of the LGBT movement. They are also kind of very pluralist, as you can see here, this is their logo. And this is also the other group that I talked about previously, the Labor and Justice Platform, against exploitation, against capitalist servanthood. And you have these kinds of groups who share the same decoloniality stance, but then contest the hegemonic power of AKP as well as Necip Fazıl. There are also groups that are continuations of Necip Fazıl's thought. Okay, this is a thank you. Sorry, it's a bit too long, but
thank you. We have a lot of time for discussion still, 15 minutes. I know Miriam has to leave early, so I'm going to give the floor to her.
Thank you. My students will be fine if I'm a bit late. This was a fascinating talk. Thank you so much. And I've been trying to unpack a few things, so bear with me in the 5 minutes before my students are going to have a meltdown because they have a midterm coming up. And yeah, just the richness of the concepts and taking these ideas seriously, I found really generative. So one, if I'm reading you right, there's also a warning story here about the political uses of decoloniality as a counter-hegemonic project, but then can be used for things that as leftists, perhaps we don't want to get behind. I'm also thinking about India recently. And so I'm wondering if you have a kind of warning tale or a set of concerns around the uses of decoloniality, which leads me to my second question. I've been writing a little bit about how from the Algerian context, Malik Ben Nabi and Fenel are being taken up by the decolonial canon or have been inserted into the decolonial canon. And it seems to me that and I'm not sure you would agree, but there's a tension between seeing Islam as inherently outside of Western modernity or already delinked, the way I think Mignolo tends to do, and the kind of strategic use of Islam for this delinking. That is, what are the risks there of saying that Islam is necessarily outside of Western modernity as an epistemological claim versus what I see, at least in some of my Algerian intellectuals, what they're doing, which is kind of using Islam to make a strategic argument when, many of the thinkers that you referenced, Afghani, Sayyid Qutb, they're certainly grappling with these concepts to use it against the West, but have been trained abroad, dropping out of Istanbul because of gambling. So those are two really big questions, and I'm sorry I don't have more time to be here for the rest of the discussion. It was fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Okay,
Go ahead.
yeah, this is definitely no. When a friend of mine recently told me, I'm just referencing her. What I'm trying to do here is the whole debate on decoloniality is quite normative. That it's seen as this liberation, and that's even how Mignolo and his company is using it. I'm using it as an analytical term. I'm not taking part. I'm not saying it's good or bad, but I'm looking at how it's used. But what I'm also trying to say is that it's used in very different ways, and some of it is exactly like how you mentioned. It's a kind of yes, definitely, especially the AKP today. I don't have time to go into that, but it's using it largely. Erdogan is constantly on their lips in the upcoming electoral campaigns. He uses this a lot. How they are representing the true colonial break from the every day he mentions something like this. How the opposition groups are servants of America, are servants of Europe, Westernization. So this is very much used by the for completely populist reasons. It used to be more genuine in the early years of his rule and was supported by this whole thing. I should say this whole field supported Erdogan AKP in the 2002 when it came to power. Full all of them, including the Muslim anti-capitalist Muslims, socialists, left, all of them. But eventually, one by one, they broke out. The first, the left, most left, broke away from AKP in 2007, as early as 2007, and then in 2010, with the Gulen issue, you're familiar with it, more broke. Now it's kind of confined to the small, very right-wing, very nationalist and conservative spot here. Now, if you keep that in mind, they're not changed. But they are all, in a sense, decolonial, motivated by this Western. But how the West is seen is very different. That's why it's come. But I use it as how they use this decolonial argument, how to justify what, and it's very different. For this left Muslim socialists, for example, I mentioned the West is capitalism, whereas for them, it's excessive materials. It's very different placement. So yes, I think it's less than a warning tale. I would say it's more. Let's look at more closely how they use it and be more aware of not all decoloniality arguments. They may sound good, but they can serve very populist, authoritarian purposes. So let's keep our eyes, the ears open. The Algerian case, I'm not very familiar with, but I see what you mean. Would say we have the same arguments, but I should say Necip Fazıl is very adamantly opposed to, and his followers, and Necip Fazıl's followers are also very adamantly opposed to this Quran-based Islamism of Sayyid Qutb, and they really hate that. They want nothing, and for them they have nothing to do with Islam. And the reverse is also true. The Quranic Islamists, those who support Sayyid Qutb in that lineage, they think Sufi Islam is not Islam. So there is this huge fighting going on between them. And I see the tension you're saying. Yes, it exists in Turkey as well. It's kind of used as not all of them, again, for the same reason. Now, some of these more traditionalists see themselves as outside of Europe. Yes, and fighting against Europe and breaking. But some of the other ones, both in the center and in the actual majority here of political movements, they don't have problems with the West. It's more just let's introduce local Islamic values more and fuse them with these Western. Now, what I want to say is what I noticed, I didn't go into that here, maybe my next, I don't know, another paper, I don't know where to do this, but I've noticed that the way Islam is used, there's a significant difference between some of these groups, also in the left as well. These Sayyid Qutb and that line, current Islam is in the center here. One of the leading ones is Haksas over there. It's the Sayyid Qutb line directly, the Turkish version of it. Their goal is Islam, to kind of restore Islam, to serve Islam, to serve Muslims, to free Muslims from the hegemony of coloniality. Whereas for more left-wing groups, like this, again, the goal is justice. And so they can very easily ally with secular groups as well. The primary goal is justice. They say we can reach justice much more better in Turkey through using the Quran. You see, the goal is that they're not trying to save Islam. They're not trying to save Muslims. They're trying to institute justice. And so it makes a whole big difference. Do you see what I mean? I don't know if Algeria has that element, but
Thank you so much. I'm sorry.
No, of course. Yeah, Sean.
Yeah, thank you. This is really interesting. So maybe in a sort of similar vein, thinking about reactions to or responses to hegemony, it seems to me that there's a big difference between, for instance, like the kind of response that says that the form of hegemony that's being imposed is like not universalist enough, that there are needs that aren't being met, and so on and so forth. And one that's more exclusionary, that divides an us and a them, right? And that, I think always, it implies a kind of nationalism. And for this reason, like you brought up sorts of examples of prelapsarianism, but there's this epistemological tendency, right, of like producing all these like binaries between man and woman. Again, the national citizen versus the other, and then also that like the intense anti-communism, I think, is something you always see in like right-wing nationalism, and you also see it in this case, right? But what this all made me think of actually was Heidegger. So I'm curious about how you see this, because, for instance, one thing that really struck me is Heidegger, for one thing, says that like technology and reason give access to like theoretical truth. At the same time, it conceals the truth of being, right? And so in the same way that like you're talking about a kind of like spiritualism, ecstasy, like just like being with love, like for Heidegger, like this would be the same sort of thing, it seems to me, that would reveal the truth of being while concealing theoretical truth. This is like one of the ways that he creates this sort of dualism, right? So I'm just curious about how you might make that comparison, or if you think it holds up, or whatever.
Okay, I'm kind of looking at, first of all, just remind you, a reminder that my approach is, I'm more interested in how they debate Heidegger, rather than, but it is debated, and they have an answer. Not how I answer, but how they would answer it. That's what I'm always going back to. Do you see what I mean? And I see that very interesting, your question very interesting, and the way they groups, especially here, I've seen this. Oh, where did it go? Okay. This journal over here, which is Divan, which is former Prime Minister Ahmet Davutoğlu, who was one of the founders of AKP and has been in colleague, I don't know if he was founder, but very close. Prime Minister Erdogan, when Erdogan became president, he was the Prime Minister, and he was former state foreign minister. And he had a university. He was one of the first universities to open up based on this foundation that produces this journal. But later was shut down by Erdogan, the whole university. That's another issue. Now, in this journal, there are issues and articles. This is mainstream kind of Sunni, but civilizationist perspective that I didn't talk about here, but I'm writing right now a paper on this. Islamic, Ottoman Islamic civilization. It's not the Quran, it's not the Hadith understanding of Islam, but Ottoman Islamic civilization. It's a civilization that where we should seek all the answers. This is the line of, there are several groups here, and Divan, just to answer your question.
Well, I'm just curious then, do you see that as, like, I'm wondering how that would relate to like the episteme, ontology,
Yeah.
like it seems to be like sort of a piece with that, or do you see it differently?
No, what I was going to say, let me finish that and then see if I'm answering. They had, I read at least 2 articles I remember where they compare Heidegger with Islamic philosophers, and they praise Heidegger. They say, you know, look, Heidegger also understood this divide, as you mentioned, but they say we discovered it first. So it's Heidegger did this in what's the years in
20th century.
Yeah, 20th century basically, and Islamic philosophers. I think they're using Ibn Khaldun a lot. I don't remember that particular, whether it's, I think Ibn Khaldun, but maybe also they talk about, I can't remember the article, where they showed this link between similar things that Islamic philosophers said 300 years ago, before Heidegger. So their main point is not to discredit Heidegger or others. They praise them. This line, that's why I started my book. They wouldn't. Okay, for them, for Necip Fazıl, they're all wrong. I mean, I don't remember what he says about Heidegger. I think, but he says things like, they kind of understand where they're wrong, where Western philosophy is wrong. Like Heidegger also admits this, for example. I remember reading things like this from him regarding who I can't recall. But he says, but they can't find a solution because overall Western political thought, Western thought disregards the human soul. That should be the center. A human is not a human unless you address his soul. Whereas you have this more centrist, these are more intellectual sophisticated as well. Necip Fazıl's intellectual sophistication is very shallow, I have to say. I mean, he doesn't quote anything, and it's said that he has all these kind of helpers. They read something and they summarize it to him in like 2 paragraphs, and then his bases his criticism on that. They can. But this Divan and all other journals here, and when you look at their references, it's full of, they have, some of these, by the way, authors have had PhDs in the United States, in London, Cambridge, Oxford. One of the founders of the universities I talked about, Ibn Khaldun University, he has a PhD from Columbia University in sociology, Recep Şentürk. So they are very well acquainted with, Western political thought, and they kind of use it to develop their own, either they say we said it first, or we said it better, we meaning Islamic philosophy, or they said, we get along. Not all of them are anti-Western at all. We should talk to each other more, but they should recognize this. They should recognize Islam. And their main objection is how Islamic philosophy is undermined or overlooked in the century. So I don't know if that answered your question, but this is the kind of what I think. I don't think anything about it in my personal view, but this is how they would answer this group here. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, I have a couple of questions. And the first one, I think, is related. What about their relation with the Western mysticism that, I'm thinking Meister Eckhart, 14th century, basically when Rumi.
Oh, I see.
So it's not to challenge the idea, we say that first. That I think is, my understanding is we say that first is more strategic than anything else.
Yeah, that's true.
I think so. So, but do they see, are they interested in the fact that even within the Western, there was something else, mysticism. So a lot of the stuff you told us, I can easily find in Western mysticism.
Yeah.
That goes back to Meister Eckhart even. goes back to Neoplatonism, goes back to goes back, and goes all the way to Simon Weil, 20th century. So there is a tradition, and maybe in the West is a kind of underground tradition. But the question is, are they interested on this tradition, or they want to be in conversation with them, or they just ignore because it belongs to the West? Second question is again, if I work, I'm sorry, this is how I work, my mind works. If I start thinking of some parallels, so and again between this mystical tradition in Europe and political Sufism, then I can see how political Sufism is a kind of a therapy.
Yeah.
And the sickness is materialism, i.e. Western modernity. And then I see some possible common solution. If I start thinking of Simon Weil, I can say, okay, look, but basically you have obedience instead of individual rights. You have a law beyond the binary reason census. You have a truth as experience and practice, in which practice is not opposed to theory, is a kind of a theory in action.
Yeah.
You have authority instead of another binary, individual liberty and state power. And you have nationalism, and I think even nationalism, I'm intrigued, I want to learn more about nationalism, but I don't think that nationalism is the sacralization of the state. If what they say makes sense, it has to be something else, something that replaces the dimension of a transcendence, not at the level of the state, but somewhere else. So there is something there that is intriguing in my opinion, because it challenges the kind of dominant Western grammar of secularism, of the state, of a political thought, and many others. So let me finish my question.
Yeah, no.
This kind of a stuff, one can say, can easily go, and I think you say that, in different political directions. It's not necessarily a conservative right-wing thing. It can be an extremely interesting way to reshape the meaning of emancipation in a way that is basically that it goes beyond the binaries. Neither nor. It's not just the authority of the text, the Quran in this case, or the Bible for the European businesses, and nor just the authority of the state. Is something that breaks binaries and goes in an interesting direction. I think what is the pity today, what is the tragedy today, is that everywhere, I don't know Turkey so well, but let's say in the West, the tragedy is that I don't know what this means, we leave all these interesting unexplored trajectories in the wrong hands. And I finished here.
No, I'm fascinated with everything you said, and personally, I don't bring this that often, but personally, I agree with a lot of things. This is one of the reasons why I find it interesting. Personally interested in this, that I find it interesting that he brings up these things, against dominant Western political thought. He does it, but you have a lot of questions there. Let me just very quickly try to address them. You also mentioned the Sean, was it right? Binary issue. I think that's
we took exactly opposite position from each other, but yes.
Oh, really? Well, but the binary issue is very important, and you're asking, are they going again outside of this binary thinking? Unfortunately, no, not many of them. But you see, I just looked at Necip Fazıl, and there's so much work to be done here. I haven't done it as deep, nearly as deep as I dug into Necip Fazıl with the others. Yes, there's so much to be done. If I begin, I might be able to find, I might be able to come up with names to you that this person does this and this. There are lists. I come across debates that go beyond this. For example, even post-structuralist theologians that I discuss very interesting things that go up beyond this binary thinking, West versus us kind of thing. There are many of them. That is not very dominant. So, but in Necip Fazıl, that binary exists. AKP, it also exists. And personally, I think one of the biggest threats and the problems with that kind of binary thinking is it excludes a huge amount of, not amount, but huge sections of the population, cultural influences, transfer, that have already been transformed and shaped by Westernization. Like myself, I grew up in Turkey, I was educated in Turkey. I wrote a Turkish article on this recently. I'm local. You know, I'm as local as it gets. I was, you know, I'm a product of Turkey. But for them, I'm not. They call us people like me, and a huge a lot of, you know, it's not. I'm not a minority. You know, Turkey has been transformed radically with Westernization. Last 100 years. Today this year is the 100th anniversary of the foundation of Turkey, Republic of Turkey. And 100 years, you have several generations who were brought up in this Westernization paradigm. So it is local. They deny that. This binary thinking says West versus us, Islam. It doesn't work. It's not how it is. So there's a huge need to go beyond. But the minute they're confined still, and IKP has been capitalizing on this, when Islam is essentialized, and there was this recent event, they immediately say, oh, we have to be this kind of very adamantly sticking to our position because the West hates us, because of Islamophobia. There was this recent incident where this a very popular TV series, this happened two weeks ago, very popular Turkish TV series that's produced by one of the mainstream channels, programs that support the AKP. I don't know if you heard of this. It shows these two families who are related by marriage. The woman, the female side is very modern, very Kemalist, very Westernized, very, and also kind of very suspicious of Islam, anything they are against the head covering the mother. And then she marries a family who's very pious and Muslim, and of everything supporting of AKP. And it kind of shows this is both Turkey. So you can't really figure out, you can't really look at things like Islam versus secularism. It's all of it all together. And they share very similar values, these two families. But this program, I think in their 23rd, 25th, 4th episode, because there was this one scene where the kind of pious Muslim, one of the family members, does domestic violence, beats up his wife. And because of that scene, the program was canceled, and in its place, the State Radio and Television Censoring Committee required the station to put up a documentary produced by them called Islamophobia. It talks about how Islam is, under threat in West. Because of this, we have to fight against Islam. We have to show the people in Turkey how Islamophobia is the biggest threat. They're trying to destroy us. They hate us. So let's get together and rally behind this cause. And this keeps producing this binary thinking, this Western, and it's also intellectually, those intellectuals who object to this binary thinking are kind of, marginalized and go off the track because of this current very polarized political situation in Turkey. But they're there. And I think, personally, I want to bring them up and, in the future, I started with Necip Fazıl because he is one of the significant names, but I also want to look at the works of people like them, like some of these, more on the left or liberal, maybe, or pluralist approaches that seek to break this binary way of thinking and produce, much more complicated, but also not let Islam down as well. So, they're trying to do both. It's a difficult situation for those, but I think it's very interesting and debates that are going on that needs to be followed. I don't know if I was able to.
What is interesting is when you have these thinkers, they are so close to mysticism, like a they are usually, Stephen May was an anarchist, appropriated by Barcelona. Because of the things you say, when you start thinking in terms of the obligations instead of rights, and that this is because the first binary you break is progress versus or versus conservatism or versus religion, secularism. So the same thing happens in some mystical thinkers.
I'd like to ask you.
Sorry.
I think I'd like to answer your question. That part of it is yes, there are. I haven't really gone into that, but I've seen articles and books even written on how the West has similar. Even Necip Fazıl, he praises Bergson and. Who was the Christianist at this? He actually met these men in France when he was in France. What was his name? Bergson, and the other one's Blondin. These are all more spiritualist, Christianist, political philosophers, theorists, who he praises. But he kind of overall. Western episteme does not allow, it marginalizes these people. They are on the right track, but they can't be heard. No one really takes them seriously because of this overemphasis on materialism and rationalism. He says, this is even Necip Fazıl acknowledges some of them as worthy. But there are those who seriously study Western elements of Western philosophy. But they also criticize it for similar reasons, that they have been pushed away, similar to how Islam is pushed away because it's based on this has spiritual elements. Right?
So Jennifer has a question. I would like to insert myself. Okay, there are many questions. We have 20 minutes. Okay, go. Okay, so I thank you for a very interesting talk. Because there are other questions, I'm not going to ask any questions. Okay. I'm gonna ask two questions that are related. So I think the first question I wanted to ask, I keep thinking about the slides you put up.
I like to have
that slide, exactly. And in a very straightforward way, I keep asking myself, what is the thing that makes us think about all of these journals together as a body of work and conversation with one another? Is it the insistence that they're operating within a Muslim intellectual tradition, within a broader, specifically Turkish decolonial tradition? Should we as, analysts think about this as one body of work? Analytically, what can we do with that, and what are the limitations of doing that? And so the next question I wanted to ask is interesting in thinking about this body of work. I noticed that during your talk, I had a kind of tension as I was trying to place what you were saying into different contexts, right? And the tension is that thinking about a broader decoloniality made me think outside of Turkey, right? It makes me think like, how does this work compared to the work of Ali Shariati? Or how does it relate to this bigger moment of non-alignment that's happening at the same time? Which is a regional moment, but obviously it's global in a certain sense as well. And this exists within a kind of tension with, especially when we think about Necip Fazıl, what would it mean to think about this as not broadly decolonial, but within a specific Sufi Ottoman Turkish tradition? How would that be a different analytical mode? And what can we see, especially in a trajectory of Sufi thought, by thinking about this specifically in time and place? I mean, I was really struck by the fact that at the moment in which he is insisting on Sufism,
as a path forward, this is a moment in which Sufism is being actively rejected in so many parts of the Islamic world.
Yeah.
Right, and I'm curious about that. Obviously, that's a broad statement, and there are many exceptions.
Very,
yeah.
very relevant.
Yeah.
I think very, very relevant. I think both questions are very relevant. I'd love to answer them. The first question, this actually they also relate.
Yeah.
I came up with this, I mean, I see it as unified, definitely, but there are many ways in which I think it is a unified field. Most importantly, there are the different groups, but many of the writers are the same people. I mean, depending on, of course, where they stand in the political spectrum. But if they're like in these, for example, this is İktidar, Buslar, these are the Quranist Islamists, okay? Here, this group over here. They are constantly in dialogue with one another. Some of them write in each other's journals. Some of them go into arguments and debates and disagreements. And then you have the same here, okay? These are neoliberal, more mainstream conservative centrist groups. They also write in each other's journals a lot. So, but the common element, I came to this after I just started looking at the journals. And then I realized that there is a coherent kind of, they don't talk outside, for example, they don't publish in secular journals. Secular journals don't acknowledge them. Also in Turkey, secular journals there are either academic journals or they are literary journals. There's nothing in between. This is many of them are not at all literary. There are some literary journals here that are also political, but many of them are not literary journals, and they're not also academic. So that's one element. But what I noticed is that all of them take Islam as their starting point. How they understand Islam, the first, but Islam, whether it's the Quran, whether it's Hadith, whether it's Sufism, whether it's civilization, that's another issue. But it's Islam, the basis. That's one. That's why I call it Islamic intellectually. The second common element here is that they're all political. So it's all political Islam. Not all of these. There's no doubt. Whoever I encountered this during the interviews I did, I'm asking, I'm not. I said to one of them, for example, Umran, this publisher here. Where is that? Umran here. This is also Islam's Quran Islam's. I asked their publisher, I said, well, I'm not taking a political stance, I said. He said, how can you not? I mean, everything's political, he said. And then he started lecturing me about how Islam is inevitably political. Whatever you look at, Islam is, both in terms of how the Prophet actually led a state. He was a state leader for 10 years in Medina. And then, there are also verses in the Quran about politics and how, rulership should take place on. So in many senses of the term, you cannot divest politics from Islam. So that's another common element. There are Islamic journals that don't agree with this. I didn't include them. But you see, so that's another one. And the third common element is what I'm saying is this decoloniality. They all debate the Western hegemony, Kemalism. Almost all of them are against Kemalism. That's a very common element and Kemalism for them. But Kemalism for them means different things. For some of them, here on the left, for them it's nationalism, ethnic nationalism. That's why it's bad. For some other left wings, it's capitalism, state-led capitalism. For here, it's this secularism. Kemalism bad because it kind of rejected Islam, whatever. So do you see what I mean? But
It's so interesting though, because it's so there are just these resonances with what intellectual debate looks like at the end of the 19th century in the Ottoman realm, right? That kind of divide, the insistence, the rejection. I mean, it has a similar kind of vibrancy and topography.
But what you didn't have then is the Quranic Islamists. That's very new and comes from, say, Qutb outside. It's that didn't exist. This leader, this Hafsa's journal is leading Islamic, it's Quranic Islamist journal. Sayyid Qutb line.
Yeah.
It started publishing in 1990. It's been non-stop publishing since 1990. And its founder, Hamza Türkmen, says it was in the 60s in one of the then popular, it doesn't exist now, journals, Hilal Journal, where he first time in his life, he read Sayyid Qutb's translation scripts from Sayyid Qutb's milestones, Turkish translations. And for the first time in his life, he realized that people actually read the Quran. In the 60s, after reading Sayyid Qutb, they realized that, wait a minute, we can read and understand the Quran. That was non-existent I mean, I don't know if it existed, but people didn't read the Quran. That was for the ulama. This is what I mean by the orthodox Sunni understanding of Islam, dominant under the Ottoman Empire, was, not the Quran. Islam is not the Quran. Now, that had effects. Afghani is known to have come to the Ottoman Empire in the mid-19th century, and he actually discussed this Islamic union, Islamic Union has the idea of having an Islamic Muslim unity over the world with Abdul Hamid too, but he was frowned upon the ideas because it is very Ottoman-based understanding of Islam. We don't need the world. We don't need to save Islam. We are enough of Ottoman Islam, this dominant Orthodox Sunni Islam is enough. So that idea, this Quranic-based Islam is new. It didn't exist in the 90s.
I mean, it's new.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, it is.
yeah, it's
Exactly.
new. Yeah.
So this is a continuation, definitely, of the 19th century debate. Some of them, especially after Tanzimat, the Westernization reforms started kicking, you have more and more debates about, what's going to happen with Islam. It's just incompatible. Is Islam compatible or incompatible with Westernization? Blah blah. All with modernity. All of these words did start being debated in the 19th century, for sure. They are now, many of them are now going back to those sources and kind of trying to recover them. But many of them have not been studied by academics either. So they're kind of doing that themselves. So the debate is similar, but it has, Rome and taken on broken branches.
So we have about 12 minutes and 30 people on the queue, Mizan, Yasmin, and myself.
Sorry, I'll try to.
Unless there are other questions, so what I would suggest is that we air our questions and then you pick and choose.
Yeah.
How you would like to do
Chair,
this.
I give you extra 15.
Thank you so much. Yeah. So, you can answer as long or as shortly as you would like. So I'm gonna give the floor to Mizan. Yeah, go.
Yeah. Thank you. Like your work is really productive for me. I am doing kind of similar kind of work actually in South Asia. So I'm working on like 3 intellectuals who and political activists who were like writing in 1940s and 60s. So one of and I see that the 3 approaches you used here, like Quran-based approach, Hadith-based approach, and like Sufi Islam as a love of God, that approach is very productive in thinking, because some of the scholars I'm working on, they are actually like I'm struggling with like to categorize their work, their engagement in Quran, Hadith, and Sufism. My question is like the magazines and journals you saw, like it seems like although you said there is an overlap, like within these 3 approaches, but I see there are kind of like separation as well. The Quran based is very like reason based, whereas Hadith is more kind of traditional and with the lineage of jurisprudence, and then Sufism is in a very different directions. But I still like I'm struggling with, maybe you able to say more like in South Asia, basically in Bengal, and there the scholars actually it's really hard to categorize scholars as Quran based. For example, like one of the scholars I'm working on, he's from Alev Hadith group, And he is like always just saying to go back to Quran, but still he's taking hadith.
Yeah.
But making in a very different interpretation of hadith, like he's saying like to look at the context. Like the hadith that was produced like in like during the time of Muhammad was a different context than today. So we have to apply reason, like not reason, intellect, to understand that the context and we use that today. So I'm like trying to say how to categorize that kind of thinking within the like tool you are using. And then my second question is like the Sufi Islam or love of God as an analytical tool of contemporary politics. Is like the way you said it, like make love or Sufi inspired love is actually used more as a kind of as a tool for political contemporary political reason, as like Islam is usually like the major argument Islam is doing like that kind of a capture in state politics. So I'm like also like thinking if that Sufi love or love for God and the love for others, that kind of analytical tool is actually offering a kind of possibility of a kind of politics or imagining a kind of political community beyond the state. So is there any you find that kind of
Wonderful questions. Thank you. I'm really happy to hear these questions because it shows me what I'm trying to say is getting through, and which is so important for me because it wasn't until about a year ago. I wasn't succeeding. So happy to hear this. Both of them are wonderful, very relevant questions. Let me say again, there's a group here. This journal here. These two. Bilgi Adam and Grounding Hayat, both of them, and the others as well on this side. They're not really left, but they are very rational, very reason-based. And among them, there's a group that are referred to as historicists, which is exactly what you're saying, what they're doing, like intellectual history. They are looking at not only the hadith, but also ayat, the verses in the Quran, as historical. And one of them, Mustafa, what was his name? There are a couple of Muslims I forgot. Do you know? I don't know if you know them, but he had to flee to Germany because his life was threatened for saying exactly this for verses in the Quran that they don't anymore apply because they were meant for those historical conditions. They apply for that context, they no longer apply. He was very vocal about this, but this recently, with this kind of authoritarian, more traditionalist turn in AKP, especially these more conservative traditionalist groups started threatening him. Actually, this leader of this anti-capitalist Muslim intellectual who says Quran is also communism, he was all beaten up. A couple of times actually for doing things like this. So there's a lot of hatred among them. But this person is like I said, not only some of them are much more openly discussing the hadith for that. That's more allowed in the Turkish context, in this pluralist context. But even the verses there are historicists who. So I would put them on this reason camp definitely. They're against traditionalism. They take this akıl-based, reason-based understanding of Islam as essentialist, and so even the Quran's verses are open to debate and contextualization. Okay, so this is historicism, part of a subset of this reason-based understanding. Wonderful question. Second question. This is something I could not go into because I don't have time. But one of the other dimensions I'm looking at is Quran-based, Hadith-based, and Sufi categorization. There's a different dimension here, what I call pro-state and pro-social. In Turkish, we have the word toplumcu. I couldn't translate it because it's kind of societalism, but it's pro-social, so bottom-up politics versus top-down politics. Necip Fazıl is definitely top-down, Sufi top-down. But most of the Sufi, political Sufi orders, like this Bektashi, for example, this Imam Rakır also, but there are other groups like that, the Muslim anarchists, for example, Manamatia, they are absolutely pro-social. bottom-up politics. So they're against the state, they're against authoritarianism. They are the ones who are contesting Erdogan's rule the most harshly right now. They're in opposition, they're supporting the opposition, they're even supporting right now the secular political parties for that reason. And here they are usually. This is this dual Judaism. And also all of these, now some of these are still supporting Erdogan because of the decoloniality, but they are also pro-social. They support, pluralism at the bottom up, well, what matters to society. What the state actually is kind of preventing the realization of, these kinds of, they don't use the word freedom, but I don't know, autonomy of civil society that's needed, So there is that element, and there is that debate, definitely. One of the biggest important dividing lines among these different groups is that pro-social versus pro-state approach. So it's there, but I didn't have time to go into it.
Okay.
Yasmin.
Thank you so much. This has been really very super rich and illuminating. Thank you so much. I have just a kind of a clarification question about whether Necip Fazıl himself, how he understands the relationship between his literary corpus and his political corpus. The reason why I ask is that the quotes you shared with us from his the ideological lattice book show or reflect that he's very much really a son of his times. Some of the stuff would be found verbatim in Qutb's writing, ironically, very ironically, I suppose, since you're saying that, almost defined that his campaigns defined themselves vis-a-vis Qutb, but really the activist trend, the statist trend, the idea, especially also with even before Qutb, Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, that society needs to be really organized through education, a family rearrangement, etc., as the basis for how this will work. So that trend is very much like a sign of the zeitgeist. Part of the sign of the zeitgeist was also, and maybe this draws upon Jennifer's question, the antipathy towards Sufism understood as anti-political, fleeing from the political, a certain, disenchantment, disillusionment with the politics as corrupting of the soul. This was for, especially during the modernist period, the way Sufism was understood by a lot of Muslim modernists. So just given that as a background, I was wondering how he himself, or maybe his closest allies or whatever, understood the relationship between these two lines of his thinking, one of which is very activist, and kind of seems to be using the love in a way that seems to be cavalier almost, like there is no, what's the substantive Sufi part of it that speaks to the statist project. And the literary part, which seems to be saturated with Sufi language, very much understandable in the traditional Sufi writing. So there is that. The other thing, and I wanted to go maybe to your original concern. You said, your original concern, the reason why you were interested in even looking at Necip Fazıl was his effect, possible effect on Erdogan or AKP or whatever. And I was wondering, if we take that line of thought to its logical end and think especially about the argument you're trying to make that, love of God as legitimating claims to be above the law, right? And if we take that in light again of the Sufi tradition's understanding of love, my question then would be, who is the legitimate lover of God? Like, in the Sufi understanding, as far as I know, you have to go through a long self-cultivation process with the guidance of the sheikh or whoever, in order to reach that status that enables you to arrive at illumination or mukashafa or, to be befitting recipient of divine whatever. But here, does Erdogan make a claim to that? Is he understood by some of those publications, or does he convey in any sense that he has reached that status of somebody who can make a claim to that? Or is this kind of just a, I was just wondering about that.
Because I see. Let me start from the last one because I think it's exciting. Erdogan, no. Yeah, short answer is no. Erdogan does not do that at all. He doesn't claim to be like closer to Allah than others. No, absolutely not. He has never done that. So he doesn't seek legitimacy as a person. He just uses it now for popular jargon. But let me say that in Turkey, Sufism is so ingrained with popular cultures. It's everywhere. It's you know, even in the sayings and the, you know, her işte bir hayır vardır. It's you know, there's a silver lining. Is the version. It's a Sufi saying. They, you know, this John Lennon's famous, you know, life is what happens when you're busy making plans. That comes from a Sufi understanding, and it's also very popular in the way it's used, and I can't remember now which, but there are lots of ways in which Sufism has already infused Anatolia. It's been around since the 12th century. Anatolian Sufism is not Naqshbandi Sufism. It's absolutely not Mujaddidi Shubs, it's Sharia. It's very, you know, Rumi and, you know, Emre, and, you know, very, very popular, very heterodox. And that Sufism is very unpolitical, you know, not anti, but unpolitical and apolitical, beyond politics, maybe the best word. It's very difficult to derive political thought from that Sufism. And they don't, except for Muslims, you know, they also, this Malamatiya Sufism is because they see the state as going in between, well, God and the individual, you see? So they're against the state, they're against organized politics, but they're in a way political. Nazmanists are very political in that sense, but in a different way. So the question is, it is usually this that's why in Turkey, Erdogan uses it for populist reasons, because it resonates. People are very familiar with that language. When you talk about love, and this is also, I mentioned the Arabesk movement. I just wrote an article on this, but it's not only me. Others who have looked at Arabesk music genre that started in the 1970s, comparable to rap, that criticizes modernity. Others have looked at it. It's very much based on Sufism. Love is praised. That they're, you know, man, woman, love, you know, that kind of love. But it is a kind of why it resonates so much with popular, because it has that Sufi dimension that love, you know, modernity interferes in love. True passion, true human value is love. And that is, you know, coming from the Sufi understanding. So it's very popular. It's very difficult for Islamic movements to criticize Sufis for that reason. They don't become very popular, although there are those who do that. But I have to say, this literary, when you separated literary language, going back to the first question, which combines, this connection between literary and political is very tightly linked in this context, because most Sufi, for example, this is a literary magazine. This has also been published at least 30 years, since the early 1990s, maybe even, or versions of it. And this has actually goes back to the 70s, again, literary circles. There were a couple of magazines that are predecessors of this. It's a big, very thick magazine. They are very political, but also very Sufi, Anatolian sense Sufi. Hece comes from Yunus Emre's poems. So it's Yunus Emre is a very popular individual, doesn't even have a tariqat. There are some who try to revive it as a but it's not. They don't have a sheikh. It's Sufism for them is a very individual journey. You don't even need a guide. It's your own journey. That's that's why they're very much opposed to Naqshbandism. But some of them are a little bit critical also of modernity. And they are, this is a very powerful movement. Literary work, there are also poets there. It started as a poetry journal, then it turned, but they debate all kinds of political issues. So you can't really separate them, and it's neither for Necip Fazıl as well. this larger intellectual sphere for them, also because under the persecution of the state, literary journals was some kind of a safer haven where you appear to be just doing innocent literary work, but you're actually doing politics. So Necip Fazıl's poems are also very Sufi, but also in a way political in that respect as well. So they don't really separate that much. That is one part of the question, and the other part is for him, political is the more it is what's his cause. Literary work serves that. Okay, his literary work, was especially his plays, directly produces them in drama. Criticizes the kind of depravity of Westernization, how people commit suicide, and serious, stuff. It's heavy stuff, very existentialist, and also, like you said, absolutely the sign of the 1950s, and influence of existentialism, influence of the Cold War, the tragedy of World War II. All of these have influenced them. I'm not an Necip Fazıl expert, and I'm not looking at it from a perspective of intellectual history, but yes, those are there. But it's literary for most of the groups I'm looking at. Definitely, some of them are literary journals. Literary work serves their political cause. They're using it for that. They don't separate it at all.
Thank you.
I don't know if it was answered.
Okay, so I'm going to give myself the floor now, and we're beyond our time. So I'm going to try to keep this brief. But first, let me take a moment to really say this has been such a textured and complex portrait of Islamism in Turkey. And I really thank you for that, because especially after 9/11, I think Islam in general has been affiliated with an increasingly conservative and belligerent bent. And you here show, it goes from anarchism and communism all the way. So there's a big range. And by the way, I cannot help but notice some of the names of the journals allude to left-wing movements in Turkey, or journals like Yolcu, for example, Traveler. There's a big established revolutionary group under that name. Birikim is a journal, a very prominent leftist journal's name. It's something I can't read. Genç Birikim, young accumulation, or something that it's not a good translation. But in any case, so there are allusions that I can even deduce from the title. So that's really very, very remarkable, and I thoroughly enjoyed that. I have two questions. One is related to the decoloniality issue that Miriam had raised initially, and something else that you said about the civilizationism. And I've recently been looking at neo-Ottomanism of the Justice and Development Party. And I couldn't help but notice that sometimes the civilizationism and the decoloniality kind of connects together. And interestingly, the justification of civilizationism under the rubric of decoloniality first allows the ruling party in Turkey to speak in the name of the oppressed nations of the world that are Muslim, while at the same time smuggling in a lot of racist stuff about previously, populations that were previously under Ottoman rule, who are never quite equal to the Turks, like Arabs and North African populations, etc. So this is a really interesting contradiction, I think, that comes together. And I was wondering if you would want to speak to that a little bit more. And the other point is, I think, a continuation or a different version of Yasmin's question about Erdogan and his commitment to the kind of ideological framework that you've been outlining for us here. Because on the one hand, he emerged as a man of principles and with his commitments that were defining him as an Islamic or political Islamist figure. At the same time, he's such a pragmatic politician that he's occupied every possible position
under the sun.
Yeah.
He's been a civilizationist, he's been a racist, he's been a nationalist, he's been, shepherding the peace process with the Kurdish population. So he's been a statist and a top-down, and he's been like promoting participatory democracy, at least in discourse. So to what extent do you think Erdogan's ideological commitments are really active and valid and guiding?
Yeah.
And I guess that connects to the question about the future of Islamism in Turkey as well, because Erdogan may or may not stay. We hope he won't, but we will see in 2 weeks, or maybe like the second round of the election. But the point is, Islamism is, or at least in my perception, on shaky ground, especially after the failed coup, which was a fight between two different Islamic factions, kind of, one party of which tried to acquire power through a coup, and the other resisting, etc., but a kind of redistribution of power among the apparatuses of the state, whatever. But the spectacle that we are witnessing as citizens is a kind of overall delegitimation in terms of the ideological content. It increasingly appears as groups hungry for power and profit, like not being able to divide the spoils. So that connects with my question about Erdogan's pragmatism. Like how strong is the ideological commitment in your opinion?
Yeah.
Anyway, I took way longer than I.
Very, very relevant questions. Let me start with the first one. My answer is much more clear, much clearer for the second one. Now, the decoloniality civilization relationship, let me put it in simple terms, not to take too much more time. I think what happens is decoloniality, which is a common feature for all of them. They're all debating, like I said, a break from the dominant Westernizationist paradigm, leads these different movements a search for what is the other. And the word there is, the crucial word there is localism. What is the local, our version of, what kind of paradigm, what kind of episteme can we have as an alternative to this Westernizationist paradigm? Civilization isn't one of the answers to that. This group like Divan and other Ahmet Davutoğlu group, but there are many others. Especially this is Keşkül is a Sufi, For example, they're also very close civilizations. They say ours is a Sufi civilization. Okay, so the civilizationism kind of has traces. It's more on the conservative right side of this center. It resonates much more here. But civilizationism, one of the answers. Understanding of Islam that I didn't put in that categorization is that it seems there's also a big debate there though. Islamic civilization versus Ottoman civilization, those are slightly two different things. And then there's also Turkish civilization, by the way. The Sufi group, this Rufai, that has female sheikhs, Cemre Sargut, Semiha Ayverdi, that names they have Kubel, so it should be there. I don't know if I put it there, but Kubel, they have a journal as well. They are Turkish nationalists, civilizationists, Turkish civilization. They are civilizationists, but not Ottomans. Turkish. So civilizationism in itself has these divides. It has definitely been used by AKP. Now, let me come to the second. How do you say there's this also they speak on behalf of oppressed Muslims around the world, but then they sneak in this. Just to put it very nicely, I'm not going to be able to repeat that, but there's inequality and authoritarian hierarchies are reproduced within that group. Definitely, Erdogan has been using this. Let me come to the second answer. What happened, like I said, now Erdogan personally, AKP with its founding years, was very skillful in uniting elements. Behind this very carefully produced kind of thoughtfully, let's say, produced view of breaking from the hegemony of Westernization and Kemalism, but without directly fighting it, without directly antagonizing it, especially in the earlier years of AKP's rule. The military, Kemalist military, was still very powerful, as you know, so they were very careful in kind of treading the way. But what united AKP was very skillful and I'm not talking about Erdogan. AKP's intellectuals, especially, included many of the writers who wrote in many of these, including Alev, who was the anti-communist, anti-capitalist Muslims intellectual, was a writer for Erdogan in the early years. He's one of the first, he said himself to me in an interview that he broke off in 2007. So taking Erdogan's views is in itself maybe misleading. I think it's a better idea to look at AKP as a whole, but Erdogan is very skillful. I mean, he's not an intellectual at all. Right now, he doesn't have a vision, he doesn't have any political ideals, he doesn't have anything, but he's a very skillful politician. He knows how to kind of put together, or his staff, I don't know, maybe it's not him. But in the early years, they very skillfully, successfully united all this behind the standard of very carefully put stated decoloniality, I'm saying. And in the beginning, they're still writing this way. We represent the oppressed people, not only on the world, but also not only Muslims, but also everyone who was the victim of Kemalist, Westernizationist, ethnic nationalism, for example, Kurds. That's how they, in 2009, they started the Kurdish resolution process based on that. Civilization is one very crucial way. We can solve the Kurdish issue because we're a civilization. Ottoman millet system, you know, the Kurds are also Muslims, so they're our brothers, and you know that kind of approach. And that brought them until 2015. There were certain divides and certain cracks, but I think until 2015, the attempt, 2016 coup attempt, there was more or less the same thing, this Ottoman Islamic civilization as a uniting force, decoloniality, not harsh, adamant anti-Westernism, but let's, you know, find our local roots. That whole idea of localism has brought them together. But then in 2016, I think what happened is in 2015 elections, when Erdogan started to lose votes, that's when, you know, staying in power became more important than anything else. I don't think anything after that, especially the coup attempt, can be taken as any ideological, with any ideological indication of anything. It's just wanting to stay in power. He was willing to do whatever it takes. And so siding with the ultra-nationalist party right now in cooperation, many of these hated ultra-nationalists and nationalism, as I said. So that was a very big turn. Somehow he was able to, that's why his organizational skills, political skills, he was able to convince many of them who are still anti-nationalists that this was the right thing to do, because we represent a higher cause of delinking from the West. So we are fighting against imperialism. So let's unite behind this. Erdogan utilizes this still to this day. His whole argument about against the coup attempt, 2016 coup attempt, is that this was organized. They don't see it as a divide between Islam. They see it as an imperialist move against Turkey. They're still saying the same thing, by the way. I don't know if you read this upcoming those last 2 days. This is unimaginable, I think. The Minister of Interior said the upcoming elections in 14th of May is a coup attempt organized by the elections. What is he thinking? I mean, I'm kind of worried that they're going to say, oh no, we cancel the elections because, and organized by the USA. Because of imperialism, they're trying to control us, we have to stand up against them. Even the elections are framed as that. The coup was very easily, from they are constantly saying they have just opened up a museum, the Democracy Museum, referring to the coup attempt, 15th of July museum, and they say this is all about, you know, how we stood up against imperialism, how they tried to destroy us. Personally, this is again using decoloniality to justify. It's just like I think this classes started intellectually, they're going to be politically, but I don't think the coup attempt has anything to do with any divides in Islam. This new movement is not here. Fethullah, I don't see Fethullah movement as political Islam. It's they don't discuss anything political. They don't have a political vision. It's just a cult missionary organization that the AKP used to replace. That's a whole other story. But it's not a fighting against amongst different Islam groups. It's more a turn. Marx, 2016 coup turned Marx a turn to fusion of Islam and nationalism. And you know, I just show you these slides. These are all after the coup. This is a slide here. This portrays the coup, how the milletes and the nation stood up against the coup attempt and against Turkey is impassable against imperialists. So it's taking up this one nation, one flag, one land, one state. This is Erdogan's famous slogan now that he keeps using. This is all, and ended the Kurdish resolution process. Went back to the 1990s anti-Kurdish, adamantly ethnic Turkish policies. And I think this just fits with his, original Necip Fazıl's approach. But I don't think it can be taken as seriously. I don't think Erdogan is serious, but you can look at Erdogan's ideological position, especially now. It's just populism. He can say whatever works for him. Hopefully it's not working anymore because of the economy. I mean, no one soon. We'll see. Sorry, I hope that answers.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
It was a great pleasure.
Thank you very much.